Hey everyone, Cole here with Classic Mini DIY, and on today's episode we are going to be going over the Classic Mini cooling system and installing an auxiliary fan amongst many other things. So stay tuned. Now, as I said, on today's episode, we are going to be covering the Classic Mini cooling system. Now, this is a hot topic for many people. Get it? Hot? Anyway, I'll see myself out. But before we get started, a huge thank you to this channel's sponsors, 7 Mini Parts, and all of my Patreon subscribers who help make these videos possible, as well as many more in the future. So if you're interested in supporting the channel, head to the links in the description and consider sending a couple bucks my way. But the reason I'm making this episode is really a comprehensive guide for the Classic Mini cooling system in the various climates that might exist wherever you live. So for those of you who don't know, I live in the American South. So I live in North Carolina, which is technically part of the South, although the name has the word North in it. I can assure you it is part of the South. And down here in the American South, it gets really hot, and I'm talking hot. So on an average summer day, it's usually between 95 degrees Fahrenheit and 105 degrees Fahrenheit. It's hot. And as a result, cars need to be able to cool themselves very well. Now, as many of you know, the Classic Mini was built originally for the British market, expanded out from there, and with that, cooling was less of an issue. The climate in England is much cooler than a lot of different places in the world. So a lot of the common issues we run into with the Mini where it overheats, things like that here in the South, or places near the equator, people who drive these in India, things like that, they just weren't present in England. So with new issues comes new solutions. Now, before we dive into all the different options that we have to cool our Mini better, I do want to address a few things. One, you don't have to have an auxiliary fan. The solution for everybody is not one of these. If your Mini is overheating, the first things that you're going to want to check are making sure the system itself is running properly. So that means making sure that your radiator is not clogged with a whole bunch of gunky old, coolant. Make sure that your coolant is clean itself. Flush the system, make sure that you even have coolant. All the lines are connected, there's no leaks. Some things, even as simple as the fan belt being loose, will allow the fan that actually is spinning and pulling air through your radiator to not work efficiently and allow your car to overheat. And then finally, more broader issues with like your tuning, the advance on your distributor, those can all have large impacts on the temperature of your car. So if your car is too advanced, for example, the air and the fuel is not fully combusting inside the cylinder. It's leaving the cylinder, going into the exhaust chamber and exploding there. So you end up losing power, but you also end up transferring the heat to somewhere it just isn't able to cool it, which is obviously not ideal. So let's step out to the car real quick. I want to give you guys a basic rundown of how the cooling system in a Classic Mini works as stock. I do have some things on my car right now that I've been using to test this whole cooling video. I'm not going to touch on those until we get into those individual items themselves. So let's step out into the garage. Okay, so now what we're looking at is, of course, the engine bay here. And for those of you guys who have a Classic Mini, you already know that the radiator sits on the right side of the car. And this is not the most efficient place for a radiator to sit, but nonetheless, when they mounted the engine transversely, instead of moving the radiator to the front of the car, they just left it on the side and said, hey, now the radiator is on the side of the Mini. So the basic pattern of airflow for your Classic Mini is air comes in the front grille, passing through the front of your car, and then the fan on your radiator takes that air and pushes it out through the fender, and so out into the wheel well and off into the world. So as you can imagine, when you're sitting still, there's not a lot of airflow coming in the front of your car and passing over that radiator, and a lot of people have, in hot climates, issues with overheating when they're sitting still, chilling at a stoplight, something like that, in stop and go traffic. Now additionally, later on, British Motoring Company, the places that made these shells, ended up removing this shroud that you can see on my Mark I Mini. Now, for airflow, that was a bad choice. But for ease of repair and ease of access, it was a great choice. So it's kind of a trade-off. And so for those of you who have a Mark I or a car with that shroud still in place, this is going to be a good chance for you to really optimize the airflow. Not to say that folks that don't have that won't be able to, but they do make attachments that you can add to that, which I'll go over a little bit later. Now, with the basics of this system out of the way, what are some different ways that you can help optimize your cooling system? Well, one of the simplest ways you can do that is by adding an additional radiator, such as a heater core. So for those of you who don't maybe have your heater connected up, you can take your heater, there's a takeoff right here, runs into your heater, out of your heater, and normally would run up to this heater takeoff. And that allows coolant to pass out of this heater takeoff through the hose into your heater, which would allow you to then heat your car if it was cold, comes back out and into the return for your radiator, ultimately going back in, passing through the water pump, etc., etc. Now, in addition to making sure that your heater is plumbed up, one other thing that you can, and I tested this out on my car a little bit, is adding an additional heater core. So this is actually just an AutoZone special. It was like 20 bucks, a heater core, and as you can see, it's just kind of set down in there for right now. But I added it to the circuit that goes to my heater. So coolant comes out of the heater takeoff, down into my core that's down here, back up, into the heater itself, and then back out and into the coolant system again. Now, while that adds a lot of capacity to your cooling system, it doesn't really help you when you're sitting still, because this relies on air passing over the radiator and cooling that coolant as the airflow goes over it. And that's great when you're running at speed, when you're driving down the road, something like that. But for most people, they don't have issues with their car cooling at speed. Most of the time, it's the cooling system not adequately cooling it while you're sitting still. And so that's where this wonderful system comes in. This wonderful system being a simple 12-volt electric fan. Now, if you've gone through all the other steps, checking your coolant, making sure it's full, clean, making sure your car is tuned properly, and also making sure there's no blockages in your system, and your engine is still getting too hot. It's still rising above the temperature that you might like while you're sitting at a light, things like that, you can introduce an electric fan to your system. Now, these electric fans are not complicated, they're not expensive, and they really do the job quite well. Most modern cars use electric fans in conjunction with the radiator sitting at the front of the car. Now, if you guys have an MPI or a later car, those actually had the radiators moved to the front of the car because it's a much more efficient place for your radiator to sit and get adequate cooling. Now, depending on how you decide you want to hook up this fan here, you will need to decide whether you need a pusher or a puller system. Now, for most applications, a puller system is going to be the correct solution for you. Now, what that means, and the reason a puller system is going to work the best, is because this fan gets mounted into the inner wheel arch. This is going to get mounted right up against the grate where the radiator sits up against in your wheel well. And the flow of the air in your car needs to be pulled out of the engine bay. So the easiest way to think about it is air is flowing in through the grill. Your normal mechanical fan is pulling that air through your radiator and then out the wheel well. And what this is going to do is increase the volume of air that is being moved out of your engine bay and through your radiator while you're sitting still when, say, the mechanical fan is not spinning very fast because your engine isn't spinning very fast. So a link to this fan is in the description. This is just a cheap Amazon fan, 10-inch in size, like I said, and this can be made either a pusher or a puller system. So let's set this up in the bench vise so it's a little bit easier to hold and to test. And what we're going to figure out is whether or not the fan is currently configured in the puller system. So, and what that means is pulling air from this side out this side, because this is the way it's going to mount. So my solution for testing this fan is pretty simple. It's a 12-volt fan, which means that we can safely use a 9-volt battery without damaging it. And we simply are going to connect the negative lead here to the negative lead on the battery, positive to positive. Let's go ahead and see what happens, eh? And there we have it. Fan is running on 9 volts, so this is much slower than it's going to run on 12 volts, but I can feel the air coming out this side of the fan, which is great. It means it's set up to be a puller already. Now these modern fans are set up to be reversible in most cases because they want to appeal to the biggest market as possible. So there's two ways that they'll generally have this set up to be reversible. One is simply swapping the leads so that the fan spins the opposite direction. The second option is disconnecting this nut right here, flipping the fan around, and then retightening that bolt on there. And whatever fan you get should come with instructions. Unfortunately, because this is kind of a budget fan that I was just testing out here, hopefully it lasts a long time, but this didn't come with any instructions. So luckily it's able to, luckily it's already set up to be a puller fan. Don't have to fuss with that too much. So let's head out to the car and mount this sucker up, and then we can connect up all the wiring. I'll show you guys kind of how I'm going to be doing that to make it a little bit less nebulous, although electrical stuff can always be a little confusing. Now first things first, we need to test fit this, and the easiest way to do that is to set it up into place and use zip ties through our grate here, through our actual radiator cowl, and this is going to allow us to set it up here, tighten it down, and we want to make sure that it doesn't foul the wheel, and we also want to make sure that we like where it is before we do any sort of cutting, because obviously don't want to measure once, cut 3 times, you know the old saying how it goes. Dang, those zip ties really hold it on there. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna put my wheel back on and give it a little test to see if it fouls it out. Perfect, so that is not even remotely close to it. That's very, very exciting. And to be honest with you guys, those zip ties, they held it on pretty darn tight. So I actually think, I know that I might get some flack for this, but I think I'm just gonna hold it up there with zip ties. I'm gonna add 2 zip ties onto each corner that'll hold it really nice and tight, and they'll have a little bit of a backup just in case. But honestly, it keeps me from having to drill holes into the Mark I body, which is definitely something I'd like to avoid doing. And if I ever hate this thing and it breaks because it doesn't work maybe in the future, I can just clip those zip ties off, unplug it, and we're done. So I'm gonna jack it up again, and then I'm gonna remove the tails on the zip ties, put more zip ties on, then we'll talk about wiring this up. And so now before we decide this is wrapped up, I am gonna take these leads one more time, attach another battery to it, just double check that this is running the right way, and that of course there's nothing fouling inside there as well. Perfect, so that is pulling the right direction. Now we just need to wire this up. And let's jump back to the bench real quick. I'm gonna show you guys how to wire this because it's really difficult to show you exactly how the wires all run and everything, and it's a little bit easier to draw it. So let's head back inside. Now let's take a moment here to kind of look at the way that this electrical system works. So first off, you have your fan over here, and you have both a positive and a negative lead coming off of this beautiful, perfectly drawn fan. Now, what happens is this negative lead gets grounded out. So this little symbol here, that means grounding. That's gonna get tied directly to a bolt on your chassis, something that is gonna have bare metal to metal contact. And the reason you do this is so that the ground, when it's connected here, will go all the way back to the negative lead on your battery. So let's go ahead and draw in our battery here. And so your battery also has a negative lead that is grounded out. And then it has, of course, its positive lead. Now this is a basic diagram of how your car works. So everything that your car uses is grounded out on the chassis itself. Unless it runs all the way back to the battery, it's much easier to ground something nearby onto a piece of metal that is then connected via the conductive material that it is back to the battery here. So I'm gonna go ahead and put a little plus and minus there for you. Now, how do we wire up a fan in a simple way that will allow us to toggle it on and off? Well, we would introduce a switch. So we have a switch here, and this switch is going to work a little bit differently than you might think. In an extremely simple circuit, you would have your positive lead here coming up to your switch and then going directly to the fan. However, if you want to introduce a little bit of safety, which I would definitely recommend, you will want to use something called a relay. And a relay is going to create a little safety circuit for you so you don't run into any sort of damaging issues with your switch, and the full load of the fan isn't always running through the switch itself. So what we're going to do is have a positive lead. This is going to come up and connect to your switch right here. So you have positive lead there, and then another positive lead, or you can consider that your switch lead is going to go into the relay. So still positive, you haven't grounded out your switch yet. Then you have a positive lead going into your relay. So we'll bring this back up. That's coming from the battery as well. So we got a little positive lead there. Then you have a lead that goes out to your fan right here, also positive, and then a single negative lead here that gets grounded out. Now, this probably looks kind of confusing, but let me explain what's happening here. So you have a positive lead going to your switch. When you toggle your switch, it is telling this relay, hey, I want you to turn on whatever accessory. In this case, it's a fan. I want you to turn that accessory on. So then what the relay does is it allows this positive lead to go into your fan, thus providing the positive power that you need and ultimately getting grounded out by the fan. This negative lead is the ground for your switch wire. So it allows a little bit of safety here. If this item ever shorted out, ever had any problems, it would damage the relay first and not your switch. It also could not cause any sort of damage to the switch itself because they're disconnected, they're not part of the same circuit. This is the general idea. This is how I'm gonna be wiring mine up. I'm not really gonna show you guys that process because it's simply just, it's too difficult for me to show you. But if you have questions about the way that this works, feel free to post them in the comment section below and I will do my best to answer those. Now, with that installed, we can now test this fan. So I do have it wired up to a switch in the car, and we'll go ahead and flip this sucker on here. And you should be able to hear that, and obviously you can see that there. Now the cool thing about this, so the way that this is wired up, is it does have power all the time, which means that in the event that I am sitting in traffic or maybe I'm sitting in a parking lot, I'm finished up driving, maybe I'm waiting for my wife to get something out of the store, you know, something like that, I can flip this fan on and it can run while the car is off, cooling it down. But let's talk about performance with this fan and with the heater core that I have installed up at the front now. So let's talk about how this performed and the results in my car. So I've learned two very important things with this. One is that the heater core installation with no fan associated with it by itself is not adequate enough to cool a car when it's sitting still, when it's idling, which is about what I expected. So that heater core is great for a couple things. One, it is great for adding capacity to your cooling system. So if you have the heater inside, then you have an additional heater core outside and your radiator, you've got a lot more fluid that's going to be running through your car, assuming you have it all filled up properly. And capacity alone on your cooling system is going to help a bunch when you're trying to cool your car. Secondly, it's going to help you at speed. So if your car is getting hot moving down the road, you know, and it's still building up that temperature, the heater core sitting in the front behind the grill, piped into your cooling system, is going to do a really great job of cooling that down while you're moving, because air is passing over that heater core and cooling the coolant inside it. Now the electrical fan that I just installed, that has been also very illuminating. With that electrical fan, I've also learned a couple things. One, it does absolutely nothing. In fact, it makes it worse if you leave it on when you're driving the car, when you're moving down the road, which is what I've been hearing from people. I wanted to test it out just to be double sure and learn it myself here on my car. But I can say with 100% certainty that if you are driving your car down the road and you leave that electric fan on, your car is going to cool worse. Second is that it helps immensely when you're sitting still at a stoplight. But being able to flip that fan on and know for sure that I'm getting some additional cooling, I'm pulling more air through my radiator, full-size radiator, has been very, very nice. And in some scenarios, I've actually seen the temperature gauge on my car move down just while we're sitting there and that electric fan is running, which is really cool. It's added a lot of peace of mind for my daily driving, especially during the middle of the summer, which is coming up soon. One other thing I do want to mention about that electric fan though, is that simply putting an electric fan under your wing the way I did is not going to be a solution for everybody. The key here is that you're pulling air through the radiator, not from around it. So if you have a later model car where you don't have the built-in shroud around that radiator, it's going to be much more beneficial to actually place it inside the engine bay on the radiator itself, because the closer you can get the fan to the radiator, the more efficient it's going to be. It's going to pull more air directly through the fins of the radiator rather than spacing the fan out and it's pulling air from around the radiator. It's not going to actually do much cooling at all. So like I said, it's lucky that I do have that external shroud there, which I never thought I would be saying, but in this scenario, it's very helpful. And if you're thinking about doing this on your car and maybe you don't want to put it inside your engine bay, then what you can do, they do sell shrouds that go around the radiator to help create that channel of air going out into your fender. However, I would lean more towards just mounting it directly to the radiator. You're going to get much better performance out of that method. But I hope you guys found this video helpful. I tried to pack it full of really good information, even though there's a little less of me actually getting into and working on the car in this one. If you guys have any questions about the stuff that I posted in this video, obviously post them in the comment section below. I do want to say a huge thank you to 7 Mini Parts for providing parts for this channel. They are my long-term parts sponsor. And a huge shout out to my patrons who help support jobs like these and help fund additional parts and things so I can test them out and show them to you guys. So with that, I'm going to wrap this one up. And until the next time, enjoy those minis and motor on.